Yeah, jokes are going to be waiting outside for a little bit, boys.
Yeah, during this phase of the podcast, there's not a lot of jokes.
Welcome to Bible Boys, a podcast where two ex-evangelical siblings and an ex-Catholic non-sibling watch Christian media and either praise or condemn it. I'm Aaron.
I'm Josh.
And I'm Michael.
This week, we investigate a Tennessee weight loss cult in the HBO documentary The Way Down. Before you listen, please be sure to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, like and comment on our video, and follow us on Twitter at The Bible Boys. So you'll notice, listeners, I didn't do like a fun call to action this time because this is going to be a little bit a heavy episode. Check the episode description for content warnings. But yeah, Michael, why don't you tell us about The Way Down?
So just up front, even though this will be included in the description, I just want to say we're going to be talking a lot about dieting and food and disordered eating. That is like incredibly sensitive, and that is kind of the tip of the iceberg here.
Yeah, when you described it to me, I went into it with a mentality of, okay, like, this is probably going to make me feel weird about, like, dieting and everything. And then when the child abuse came, I was like, oh, cool, yeah, tracks, but geez.
Yeah, this is an intersection of a lot of things I find interesting, which is, cults in general, but also the cultiness of religion and also the cultishness of weight loss and how quickly you can start believing things and doing things that you would never otherwise do when you have positions of power. Also gets into a lot of interesting discussions about power dynamics, in particular the power structures of patriarchal systems with women at the head. I just find all of this incredibly interesting. But I actually want to start somewhere different. I want to start with the elephant in the room. Let's talk about Gwen Shamblin's hair.
Yeah, this is unfortunately like her third or fourth biggest crime, but it does need to be discussed first.
She has like a 60s beehive look, I want to say.
I could have sworn, I would have put all of my money that when Michael was talking about this woman, I thought for sure that she was a Real Housewife.
I mean, she looks wilder than any Real Housewife I have ever seen.
Sure.
Like, as someone who's a bit of a reality TV connoisseur, like, how is this photo that I'm going to drop in the chat and share on our Twitter, how is this real?
I just think she looks like if I had to come up with what I think the Real Housewives look like.
Like, how is she real?
Can I reveal a little coping mechanism that I had to pull out about halfway through the first episode?
Yeah.
I just stopped believing she existed.
I mean, the world would be a better place. Just plain and simple.
It got to the point where her existence bummed me out so much that my brain went, what if she just isn't real? And I went, okay, we're going to ride this out for as long as we can.
So unfortunately, she is emblematic of a psychology of people that exist everywhere, right? Like, she is someone who is monetizing off of a belief system. And so, I tend to take a position of I don't proclaim to know whether or not someone does or doesn't believe in what they're selling, just because I think like that's a fool's errand and it doesn't truly matter at the end of the day. But let's go into a little bit of Gwen's background and talk about like kind of what we're talking about here and how this religious leader became a cult leader, and also a little bit about some of the, the juxtapositions that existed within Gwen and her rise. So Gwen came up in the Church of Christ. And so we know her as a religious leader, but the Church of Christ actually doesn't allow women in leadership. And that will come up later. I think actually this might be one of the worst things about Gwen here is that she has her undergrad in dietetics and her master's in food and nutrition.
Oh my God.
So she is a registered, yes. She was a registered dietitian. Like, that was her actual job.
I did forget that, like, in the doc, she went to college, like, studying fitness and nutrition.
So this is like a specific thing. Like, a registered dietitian is like an official person. Like, if somebody tells you they're a nutritionist, they're full of shit. If they tell you they're a dietitian, they're like licensed. Like, oh my god, this makes this so much worse.
Does this kind of remind you, like, I know a couple people that, as my famous non-existent religious studies minor, where I met a lot of people, and they're like, yeah, I'm studying to run a church. And I'd be like, what kind of church? And they would mention, like, you know, some very strict religious organization. And I'd always be like, how did you get to that? We're learning the same things. How'd you get there from what we learned? And it does baffle me that she studied, like, the correct dieting, like, steps through science, and was like, what if you, like, starved yourself?
Well, okay, so I actually think that's a really interesting window to talk about this. Let's talk about, like, what her program is. So she started The Way Down, which was a series of workshops that were particularly targeted around women. And basically what Gwen is describing is just a system of eating called intuitive eating, where you eat when you're hungry and not when you're not. And you're supposed to listen to your body. And she proclaims that this was a message from God. And that would kind of be like if I said, hey guys, so God introduced something brand new to me. It's this concept that when you hold something up, it gets dropped down to the earth because of the magnetic pull in the earth's core. I'm calling it God gravity. That is the equivalent of what she did. She did not invent intuitive eating. It's been around for hundreds, if not thousands of years.
I would argue,
and most of us actually
millions of years, because that's just how your brain works.
Yeah, that's actually how most of us eat anyway.
The worst.
And, you know, I think that that's really interesting, right? Because one could argue the Way Down's foundation is actually not the religion, nor is it the disordered eating parts. Actually something that's really common sense, and like a reasonable dietitian could tell you, hey, a really good way to manage your weight and be in a like healthy state for your body, which would not include junk science like BMI, etc. I will go on a separate rant about that, I'm sure. But by doing intuitive eating, listen to your body, eat when you're hungry, stop when you're not, call it good. But what happens here is we actually get this really insidious cross-section of religious purity and a culture that views fatness as a sort of, you know, lapse in personal judgment and a moral failing. Gwen also didn't invent that.
I do, before we get too deep into the idea of like Christianity and holiness and skinniness, want to touch in slightly with the what I like to refer to as the girl boss beginning of the documentary, where it is like this woman, you know, breaking bounds, being a female, speaking out in the church, and it's so important to mention that that is a like very different and new idea. Also, it didn't seem, I don't know, man. It just felt a little like women can do terrible things too.
Yeah, so let's touch on that for a minute though, because the documentary explains it, I think, better later. I think it's episode 2, might be 3. So both times, I've now watched this twice, and both times I literally just could not stop watching it. So I watched all 3 in one sitting really easily without even thinking twice. So in the church hierarchical structures, Gwen is the top. So she left the Church of Christ and formed her own church, which is what we're talking about here, and that's the Remnant Ministries. So Gwen is the preacher, the leader here, but all of the deacons and church leadership are still men. And so it is kind of a chicken and egg argument of who's actually in charge. I would argue it is Gwen, but she is actually perpetuating power structures by the people at the bottom of this pyramid. The people in the ministries that are funding the top are women. right? Like, if you look at most of the interviewees, most of the people who were attending the Way Down workshops, they were women. But when you get into the church membership, the next rung, okay, like you've got maybe 50-50, and these are just your regular churchgoers still giving money, right? And then you get to the next rung and it's, oh, these are all men. And at the top there is a like female CEO per se of this church. But when all of the leadership anywhere else are men, you're not actually talking about a woman breaking barriers, right? You're talking about someone who climbed the top of the ladder and pulled it up behind her. So I actually think that's kind of why the documentary was framed this way. And it should also be noted that one of the directors was actually someone who directed a couple of interesting documentaries, one about Robin Williams, and then the other was Roman Polanski. Yeah, the fucked up.
What a wild trilogy right there. Easiest fuck, marry, kill I've ever had to play.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Please elaborate.
You're the one who has created a God's Not Dead, a Bible's Boys continuing theory of fuck, marry, kill.
Oh, well, you would kill both of the people that are terrible, and then you'd fucking marry Robin Williams.
All right. Boo.
That's a cop-out.
So, from my understanding of what the documentary was trying to put forward, she's a girl boss in the same way that, like, Thatcher was.
Yes.
Right. Like, and that's the thing, right? Like, the documentary, I think, does a good needle threading of, hey, this is how she was viewed in evangelical circuits in these communities where women are not allowed to be leaders explicitly, right? Like, there is something to be said about leaving an organization because they say women can't be in power, because in the Church of Christ, her first husband, was like the figurehead, right? And it is just an interesting bit of psychology, that the fact that she did kind of pull the ladder up from underneath her, but that her chosen heir is her daughter, not her son.
Yeah, she doesn't like her son, though.
No, and, let's get into that, too, is that her son is someone who struggled with his weight, with addiction, and instead of viewing that sympathetically, Gwen and her church view those as all sinful, right? So she has this like really famous quote about bowing down to your refrigerator rather than God.
Love to repeat.
Yeah, and I mean, it's a pithy one-liner. Like, in the 90s especially, like, our culture was really fertile ground for that conversation, right?
This is such a callback. It reminds me of the Casting Crowns song of, Oprah asking Oprah what to do, where they say a one-liner, and then you go, okay. Because it's not a good one-liner, but they're clearly so proud of it. I think you would do the conversation a bit of justice, Michael, if you were definitely the member here to be able to do this. Just given, like, a paragraph about, like, what is the church that, like, was founded, like, what the weight loss thing that came before it. Because if you want, like, a deep dive into that the entire thing, the podcast, we'll do our best, but the documentary is very good. I recommend checking it out if you want, like, the information about it. But I feel like you'll be able to give a nice summary so people can kind of place themselves as we talk about these, like, bigger themes.
Yeah, so the Way Down Workshop, it's a weight loss program that's all about intuitive eating. You don't do weigh-ins, you don't do calorie counting, you don't do exercising, you don't restrict anything. And they actually use the Bible verse where Jesus says all food is clean. So there is some, like, biblical inspiration here, right? And the idea is that there are no unclean foods, eat what you want, you just have to be smart about it and put God first. So when you get that, like, munchy, I'm bored, I want a snack, if your stomach's not growling and you're feeling hunger pains, what you are told to do is go pray. You're secluding yourself, you're thinking about God, you're meditating on your faith. And the idea is that you replace, it's actually, again, a, like, psychological thing that's not untrue when you're dealing with addiction, right? Is you're replacing one habit with another. she's having you replace mindless snacking with, praying, but is also saying that you shouldn't eat until your stomach's growling, which is a highly debunked myth. And I actually have some debunkings that I want to do about the weight loss program, but just want to get into a little bit more of it. So she began it really heavily in the 90s. So it was in Bellevue Baptist Church. It was 12-week seminars. And then in the mid-90s, it exploded. It started being offered in Europe in about 600 U.S. churches. And then, yeah. Well, and then a year later, in 1995, it was in 1,000 churches in 49 states in Great Britain and Canada. 96, it was 5,000 churches, with 10% being located in Tennessee.
Somewhere John Calvin was going, what the fuck? This is just me with extra steps.
Yeah. And they started having an annual convention. There was 21,000 classes with 250,000 participants worldwide in 98. And, this is really when she took off and decided, I am no longer going to be a member of the Church of Christ, because I published a book. It was called The Way Down Diet in 97. It sold more than 1.2 million copies. And so she decided in 99 to form the Remnant Fellowship Church in Franklin, Tennessee.
This church came out the year I did.
Yes. And so the official building of the church was finished in a 40-acre Brentwood, Tennessee lot in 2004. And right around then, in the early 2000s, is when criticism of Gwen started really ramping up in Christian communities. So I actually think this is an interesting on-ramp, because we've mentioned some of the secular criticisms, but let's talk about the Christian criticisms.
Can we talk about the best person in this fucking documentary who has some criticisms towards her, but also discusses, like, the Christian angle? It's the cowboy with the southern accent.
The cowboy is the best.
He is so good. There were two people they interview regularly that just warmed my heart every time they were on screen. So it just opens with a scene where, I guess in 99, she came out against the Trinity, and it, like, split the people that followed her in half.
Yeah.
And, like, this guy moved to Tennessee, like, his wife started going to church, and he goes, I'm a Baptist. That was his first sentence, and I'm like, nice. And then he said he's Cherokee and Chickasaw, and was a cowboy. So those are the three things you need to know about this man. And he was like, so I didn't have anything to do with it. And I don't know which one of those three facts are supposed to make us go, oh, he clearly believes in the Trinity. But all of them just filled me with joy.
I think the Baptist part.
I'm a Baptist.
Yeah, it was really funny. And I also think it is important to note, like, she did cause a stir by basically, saying God is above everything else. And that's the thing. Christians, I'm not one of you. I won't pretend.
Our
But
large Christian audience.
As someone who has, like, a little bit of a, will they, won't they, with the existence of God, does it really matter if it's one or three, all parts of the same one? Like, we're really splitting the finest of hairs here. This should not be your off-ramp to this woman, in my opinion.
I do love in the documentary, they're like, the Trinity has been well established for thousands of years. I'm like, the Aryan church would like to have a couple words.
Yeah. So, it is interesting. Also, there was a big bit of criticism for how she used Christianity as a bit of a label to market her book in particular and her weight loss program. There were a lot of Christians that were like, hey, we're fine with, like, a faith-based approach, but they wanted it to look more like AA than like a Weight Watchers program that you sign up and subscribe to.
I feel like it's important to note, as we're kind of talking about, like, you know, the Christian response to it. You highlighted this idea before, Michael, of the extreme fertile ground that was the United States for this kind of ideology at this time period. The idea of, like, weight loss, like, this nation has been a weight loss nation for many decades, and the amount of money that is in, diet companies is very extreme. And then if you target women specifically, who are targeted with just all sort of societal sticks, no carrots, just sticks, to look certain ways, and then finally adding the component of Christianity behind it. I don't know if this uncovered any memories for you, Michael, but do you remember when our church had a weight loss program?
Of course I do.
Yeah, and our family joined, and I remember very young counting calories for a church program. Oh, Aaron's making a face like he wants to give me and Michael a hug.
This is very sad.
Yeah, this was a thing. There was also the Daniel fast that we did annually, where you like use the book of Daniel to make yourself fast. And so, okay, listeners, this is going to be super cheery. Like, I myself have been in recovery for disordered eating, and it's so directly tied, right? Like, you have this like religious expectation that like your body is a temple, as Gwen says, to the Holy Spirit. It is not yours. You're supposed to have it be in its peak condition. And then you also tie together things like, you know, the biblical story of Daniel and all of these things around food and dieting that are almost biblical. And like, I feel like it's almost based on a true story Bible, like where it's not actually based on a true story, but it has enough of the details that we can call it that. And so, yeah, of course, I do remember. And, you know, the one big difference is that the church didn't really make any money off of it. But I don't think that makes it less insidious. I think it just makes it less capitalistic.
I also find the absolute gall of this woman to go on, I think it was a radio talk show, where she said that you don't own your own body. And that's so bad for our society, for people to say and believe. That's rough, folks.
But I feel
but evangelicals...
Yeah, exactly. Like, evangelicals have been saying that shit for decades. Like, I think that she's just capitalizing on it in a specific way to our targeted audience.
Well, and I think Gwen is really, to me, she's like a symbol. She is not... So I really try to avoid like heroes and villains and things like that. She is a person, but she is like truly a product of this large system. The unfortunate fact is there are thousands, tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of Gwens in our country. Just everywhere. They exist. They're just not selling millions of books based off of it.
And I truly believe Gwen would have been in the same location if you remove the societal norms of evangelical Christianity. Like, if society had been built differently, like, she still would have found an avenue.
Oh, yeah, because she's a con woman, right? Like, con people, they, you know, and her second husband is also a con man, which is really funny, too. We'll get into him.
Oh, the bad country music in this fucking documentary. Yeah, I am clearly not releasing enough self-titled tracks, because, like, when they do the documentary about me, they'll have nothing to work with. Oh, they'll just play this exact clip.
You need to start pumping them out, because, you know, like, those two were out to make money, and that was the end game. And I think this particular strain of con is uniquely evangelical and a product of the systems in place. But I do agree with you. Someone like Gwen and her second husband, who she's never going to really learn his name, Tarzan. Tarzan.
It might actually be Joe.
I think it's Joe, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because it was Joe and Michael in the show who both had music careers.
Yes.
We need to talk about Joe, because he's one of the funnier components until it gets very, 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 very depressing.
I think it starts depressing with Joe. I think it starts depressing and gets funnier because they unravel the funny things. So I feel like we should...
I'm so curious to see where you think the funny is, because it starts with this dude who's an actor who sleeps with older women to pay for his acting career.
It starts with my 10-year-old child. I'm in a lawsuit with the Shamblins.
That's where it ends.
So I guess I just watched it today. The second episode opens with them interviewing Joe's ex-girlfriend, who is in a prolonged custody fight at the time. So mind you, this documentary, the part that we have watched was all shot before Gwen and Joe die in a plane crash. That is not spoilers. That is the opening scene.
Well, it shows news footage. It doesn't, like, show it going down while she's like, buy my book!
So Joe's ex is suing them for custody of her child. She's really worried about this girl being caught up in a cult. And then we, like, start peeling back the layers of everyone knowing Joe through acting school and about how he played New York Tarzan in, like, a TV movie, and then has this music career, and basically was, like, an aspirational dater where he would always find, like, sugar mamas to take care of him. And Gwen basically cast him as her husband.
Right, like, there is a narrative in this story where they're like, I don't know who's using who, like, it seems like maybe, Joe is in charge because he's the man, but maybe Gwen is just using him because he's a good figurehead. Like, it's pretty clear based on both of their histories that they both know exactly what they got.
Yeah. The roles make a lot of sense, I think, to everyone. Another great individual, I cannot remember her name, but it was one of the ex-members. And she was like, how are you going to get married when your divorce finalization happened yesterday?
Well, yeah, she married him the same year. And so her first husband was a co-founder of the church that she, like, expunged from the records, which I think is really wild, but also never really let him speak publicly because he was an overweight guy. Yeah, and she then treats her son the same way. And her daughter, who is, like, this, very waifish Christian figure that is really, like, you see a mini Gwen being sculpted out of her. Like, she, to me, really reads as a true believer in this. Whether or not Gwen is, I think, is up for even more debate. But her daughter seems to be fully immersed. And so we're not going to get super into her daughter because that is actually going to be coming in part 2, which is going to be released next spring. So yes, you better believe we're going to make this a 2-parter because it needs to be.
Also, with Joe, he wanted to be a musician. And imagine hold music and then Michael having to describe the plot of a country song. That's the lyrics.
Yeah, it does seem like a spoof on country music, which I find really funny.
It's very like, my pa said cows were outside. And it's like, whoa, dude. I like country music because a lot of it, because some of it is like, hey, join the union and go fight the capitalists. And then you've got the other part of country music, which is like, pop country music. Listen to whatever you want. I'm not going to judge you. But if you listen to this dude's music, I don't know what you're looking for. You're looking for a favor from Gwen.
Yeah, for real. And, like, that's the thing, right? Like, I think that they both had a real utilitarian use for the other, because Gwen is wealthy. Full stop. And will fund this man's career. And Joe looks the part. He's a fit guy that's, to quote one of my favorite films, not totally unfortunate looking.
This is the wrong time to drop this fact in there, but how could we go, I don't know how long we've been recording, a certain number of minutes without mentioning that this does fit into our extended universe? Jimothy Baker is shown in this documentary.
Uh-huh.
Now, it was for 5 seconds, and it was him being arrested. Which I do believe is his finest 5 seconds.
I do think that is the pinnacle of Jim, so.
Because it's in the girl boss section of the documentary where it is like, they make a very good point. I keep goofing at it. It just drives me nuts sometimes, the narratives that are formed around absolutely terrible women. But like they make the point of like, at the time there were a ton of men that were pastors and they were very clearly terrible people. So like the idea of a woman coming up that, I mean, at the very beginning seemed to fit the narrative that she was pushing. Personally, I think I would have preferred that more with the juxtaposition later, as they were able to be like, now she doesn't really fit that image anymore. Like, she became like a pop star in her own mind. They also used some interesting language to describe what she looked like later, which I didn't love.
Yeah, that was from the church members. And so this is kind of my take on it. I think it's inartful. It is not something that any, like, journalist... It's not something I would say about Gwen. As a documentary filmmaker, if that's what someone chooses to say, you leave it in.
Yeah, because it came from the person, I understand why they did, but, like, it's an interesting choice. Also with things
so like it's shaming Gwen on her look. So I actually have a quote from one of the directors of the documentary that I think is really important. And this is from The Guardian. This is an article called "This is a Cult: Inside the Shocking Story of a Religious Weight Loss Group." And the director says, people talk a lot about her makeup and her hair. And of course there's a funny aspect to it, but that is a mask. That is a facade in itself. It is a perfect representation of her doctrine and the way she approaches the world, and the way that she has her members portray an image of perfection and happiness and joy to the outside world while they're suffering internally. It's armor. It's a way to, like, deflect, right? Like, when I see the way this woman is portraying herself, unlike some of the churchgoers who they see it as, like, someone who's taking themselves very seriously and, like, trying to look sexy, I see someone who's like, talk about anything other than the fact that I am running a weight loss cult. Talk about anything else. In my deposition, talk about my fucking hair. Talk about the fact that I said, well, the definition of profit depends on who you ask. Just talk about my hair, my makeup, my spray tan, my outfit. Like, literally talk about anything else. It feels like a deflection, like, PR stunt.
I can definitely see that. Part of me thinks that it's just looking like you think someone of power should look. And that's the vibe I got, was that she was dressing like, you know, what you would... Because I think if we all just suddenly had a ton of, like, pick out an outfit of someone rich and famous, we'd pick very wildly different outfits, the three of us. That would be very funny to see. But I think for her, it was this, like, Dolly Parton-esque... I feel bad for even mentioning Dolly, but, like, that does seem to be what she was going for. Yeah, I've brought up her appearance, which may be the thing she wants us to talk about, other than the fact that her church tells people to beat their kids.
Yeah, I think it's time we get into the
child abuse portion of the podcast.
The child abuse portion. Yeah, so this is a little, like, Russian nesting doll of terrible, right? So, like, we start with the outside doll of, this is, like, a weight loss scam that is selling things that are already known, and then you pull that open and it's like, oh, this is specifically targeting women, and then you pull that open and it's like, oh, all the leadership are still men, so, like, this isn't really feminist at all. You pull that open and it's, oh, you're actually, like, sanctioning eating disorders and, like, telling people, like, don't eat for weeks and starve yourself, and that's better than being fat. And then you open it up further and it's like, oh, cool, at the core of this, there is a literal child that died. So let's talk about that scandal.
Yeah, jokes are going to be waiting outside for a little bit, boys.
Yeah, during this phase of the podcast, there's not a lot of jokes. So she allegedly told parents, hit your kids with glue sticks, spoons, rulers, so that way they can obey blindly.
Until they cry.
It wasn't until they stop crying, right?
Yeah. And the idea is that if you don't do that and you just keep telling your kids and then they obey like the 5th time you tell them, well, then they are autonomous over themselves rather than submitting to God. That is the extension here.
It's the ladder of authority, right? Because if, God gives their authority to the man and then to the parent and then to the child, right? It's disrupting that chain.
And spare the rod, spoil the child. Like, it's a whole thing that is like commonly used to perpetuate this sort of child abuse.
Loved hearing that growing up. As people tried to defend the absolute... Because most of the time when I heard it, it was someone saying, like, yeah, my parents used to beat me until I couldn't walk, but, it made me the man I am today, and I'm, like, the worst person I've ever met, and I'm 8.
So here's the quote, and it's fucked up. It's more fucked up than we could ever say, so I'm just going to quote it directly. The way you show God you are answering to him is through obeying your mother and father on the first time. If you obey on the 2nd or 3rd time, you are being your own God. And no one playing around like that can ever go to heaven. So you only will live a few years on earth and then you will have a horrible afterlife. If you don't obey mommy and daddy on the first try, you will be taken out and you will be very, very sorry. And in a fucked up way, she is right. So we're going to talk about this Atlanta couple, Joseph and Sonia Smith, and their son, Joseph. So they beat Joseph constantly. Glue sticks, belts, coat hangers, locked him up while his hands were tied. The kids would get 10 blows each that Joseph was constantly misbehaving. They locked him in his room constantly for days and weeks at a time, only given a bucket for a toilet. And sometimes they would have their older son hold Joseph down. On October 8th, 2003, they had disciplined him several times, and they locked him in a basket, and he died likely from a combination of suffocation and a head wound inflicted by the top of the basket. This couple also had an infant die of SIDS, which is sudden infant death syndrome, which basically means your baby died and we don't know why. So the documentary seems to insinuate that this child could have been killed from abuse. I actually don't think that's helpful because we know one of their kids died from abuse. Like, why are we doing this when, unfortunately, unexplained infant deaths are things that do happen. And I think that sometimes it can be really traumatizing to parents who have lost a baby this way, who have done nothing at all, right? You just go into your nursery, your kid's dead, we can't really explain why. I don't think it's really useful to then be like, oh, SIDS, that's suspicious. It's like, no, it's only suspicious because these two are in prison for life plus an additional 30 years because they killed their child.
This is... I gotta be careful because I might get, like, full anger mode, which is fair. The most frustrating part of this entire thing is at like peak anger, they had the deposition where they were interviewing her, and they got it on tape. Is that what they're called, deposition?
Yeah.
Okay. Where they have her on tape, like, talking about Gwen talking about, like, what the church, like, beliefs around this. And they literally play a tape of the mom of the child who was beaten to death. And she's like, oh, these methods have helped so much. Like, the ideas of, like, hitting my kid have helped. Like, literally saying the things. And then Gwen's like, that's not what I said. That's edited. And it made me just want to scream. Oh, my God.
Well, yeah, because the idea here is that Gwen is a mouthpiece of God and can not be fallible, right? And she is buying into that, or maybe not buying into it, right? But is using that, and it uses it rather deftly in these depositions where, it's always plausible deniability. It's always like twisting things just enough and obscuring just enough that you're like not fully saying the thing that you're saying. And so then she can come back to her congregation and say, look, they tried to get me, but like, they can't mess with God. But then also she can say to authorities, I cooperated with you. And so we see this time and time again, all the times that she's deposed for things. This is just like such a bleak incident where I feel we don't even fully understand this cult yet. And I think we're bound to learn more about this from ex-members, because one little wrinkle here is the reason this is two parts is HBO has been trying to make this for quite some time, and these directors have been working on this for quite some time, and no one would really talk to them. So like a lot of these ex-members would say things, but if you notice, a lot of them have been ex-members for like almost a decade. It's like 2013, 2014, 2015. They're like, you know what? Fuck you, Gwen. We don't care. But you're not seeing a lot of recent members, and you're definitely not seeing current members. And I think that is really saying something, that the fear that this woman has over the congregation, and that her death kind of is what really catalyzed some of these like extensive interviews. And it's why this is coming out in two parts, because there's more. There's more there. There are things that we're only scratching the surface with, because we saw the Russian nesting doll and it was well reported on The Way Down. That was like very clear. We knew about that, and we knew it was kind of culty. We knew that she was like coercing employees to join it. And like it was this fucked up power structures, eating disorder factory guised as religion. What we didn't know is that this had a body count because of how she's teaching discipline. So what else are they teaching? I mean, we know for a fact they're teaching you can't talk to people outside of the church, right? There's that terrible story of the girl Delaney who got swept up in this church and won't speak to her parents anymore.
That one was also very upsetting. Just watching them try to figure out, how to have a relationship with someone in a cult is just something that we as humans, I don't think, are prepared to be able to have. That, like, you're not just born knowing how to navigate those waters.
No.
Who really knows how bad this whole thing is? And there were a lot of younger people that were discussing, like, their friend would die, or like die of an overdose because they're depressed, because they can't be depressed. Like the church is literally like, that's not a thing we accept, and there's no outlet there. It's just obedience, and the amount of damage that it's done, we will never know, because churches are protected like in this nation to a degree that allows things like this to just kind of bubble up. And I really have a nuanced opinion on at what point do we go like, actually, maybe that religion we should look into just a little bit, because I know that can get weird. But like, man, we really should have looked into this one before.
Right, like it has a lot of the same hallmarks of Scientology. I think that's how we should really think about it and talk about it, right?
We mentioned it. We're gonna get a pamphlet.
I mean, bring it, bitch. That's on my docket of things for us to cover, so...
I think probably the most insidious part of this cult for me was at least the way that they used those relationships with children specifically to control the other people in their lives. Like we talked about, the girl whose parents were like, hey, please don't join this cult, but her boyfriend kind of converted her and eventually ended up forcing her into it. But like, especially the ways in which they deploy lawyers, and like one of the allegations against one of the ex-wives was that she sexually abused their daughter, which was just, false. But like they, get them in these protracted legal battles, so that way the family member who is still a member of Remnant Baptist, or it's not Remnant Baptist, but Remnant
Just Remnant,
Fellowship.
yeah.
Don't throw that one on us.
Yeah, no.
Even though we did make it.
No, Church of
the
Christ.
member who is in the church like will retain custody of the child. Like it, I really find that very interesting because like that's a very shrewd way to control people, if not just blatantly evil. But I thought it was fascinating.
Yeah.
Well, because the amount of areas that can go of just telling women like, if you leave, you won't get to see your kids. But also staying includes so many like evil acts of like even like sexual assault and like, which is something that we haven't touched on, but like is a component of it, of just the obedience to the church and to a husband that is an absolute tool. It's
right, like, and the whole like stay with your man, right? Like divorce is frowned upon, but
unless you run the thing.
Again, like I do think this is so emblematic of evangelical churches. Like we know people who have said that about divorces, right? Like you need to make it work at all costs. You made a promise to God. It's not about your earthly relationship. It's about your heavenly relationship. And like God doesn't recognize divorce and like all of that. It's really just so fucked up when, hey, this person's abusive. Doesn't that make everything null and void?
I also want to point out that we know people that match this completely. Not only would they say don't get a divorce, they'd be like, don't get a divorce. Yeah, I did get one, and then I did remarry, but like, listen, it was cool when I did it.
Yeah. Like, wave it away. And that's always how it goes, right? Like, there's this, like, blatant hypocrisy at its core that I think is very human in nature, but also just, like, never not disgusting. I do have another little tidbit here that, like, piggybacks off to what you were saying, Aaron, about, like, them paying for legal services. This church really falls into the cult mentality because they create a community. It's a fucked up community advocating for child abuse, staying with an abuser, and eating disorders. But it is a community, right? Like, they paid for childcare, offering babysitters, in-house homeschooling, on top of paying for your legal fees to make sure that you get, you know, custody of your kids, or if like you have a divorce or whatever. And that is what happens when you have such a wealthy figurehead that can just throw money at a problem, and also is charismatic enough that she can say, hey, I need you to babysit this other member's family for free.
Well, and also, like, they were trying to get it to the point where there were, like, dentists and hairdressers and, like, auto repair, where if you left, that also meant you had to give up your job, which, as we know in the United States, means that you just die. Like, it's... Oh my god. It felt like a city town back in, like, the 1880s.
That's exactly what it felt like, and I think, again, another very interesting strategy on Gwen's part is just, like, the ability to bring together all these people and be like, you do not need anything else outside of this community. We have all the specialties. We have all the resources that you could want. You know, this is now, you know, you're a state within a state. And like, you know, this is like very much like, you know, post-apocalyptic fiction where it's just like, okay, you know, one religious group just like gets all the people together and then creates their own nation. And like, it definitely seems like, you know, you hear this all the time with cults, like where they will get a compound together and then like, you know, in a couple of years, fucking ATF has to break down their walls. But like, it is very emblematic of that. And I think she was doing it in a very smart way, which is very scary.
Yeah. And, you know, I think this whole, every cult is kind of an accidental endorsement of a really robust social program that we are in, like, of a welfare state that just has never existed in this country, where it's, God, if we had healthcare that was free or affordable to everyone, and childcare that was accessible to everyone, and I don't know, paid family leave, then maybe people wouldn't be looking for these sorts of things in their churches. And one can argue, like, a church needs to do charity, but also, like, do we really want churches like this stepping in and being someone's lifeline? I don't. I can say that pretty confidently.
I don't think it can be defined as charity if there is a, like, we get something out of this. And that is at this point, they're just buying people's, like, loyalty.
Yeah.
God, I have not been this, like, upset with a thing we've watched in a minute. This reminds me a lot of Jesus Camp. That's a good back-to-back listen if you want to ruin your weekend.
If you want to have a shitty day, yeah.
I'm going to make a
Honestly,
playlist of our absolute, like, you just want to cry, listen to these. It's all Michael picks.
Yeah, it's all of my really depressing documentary picks. Don't worry, I have more of them in the docket. So if these are your favorite genre of episode, I got you.
Fuck it. Next we're watching the Gay Imagine Dragons documentary. Fuck you, Michael.
No, I'm gonna make us watch the Netflix one on conversion therapy.
Jesus Christ.
Yeah, that is something that I was remarking on that we didn't quite get in this particular. I feel like I almost have a little bingo chart with these cults, and we did not get any gay to straight conversion situations.
They're busy.
Yeah.
I think if enough time she would have gotten around to it, but she's a little busy.
Yeah. I mean, I guess it's probably like, we're more concerned about the weight loss thing because you can just tell people to stop eating, I guess.
Oh my god. Is that all of the big points?
Yeah, I mean, I've pretty much covered.
I do have a point that I have absolutely no follow-up to. This is a Chrissy Teigen produced thing. I saw that name and went, what?
Yep.
So I'm going to add that to the list of things I learned about Chrissy Teigen against my will. Thanks, Internet. It's right next to Will Smith used to puke because he had so much sex.
What?
Oh, you guys didn't have to read that article? Yeah.
No, I have her blocked on Twitter.
No, this is Will Smith. Will Smith had so much sex in his 20s that he would puke.
Because he was so winded, or
I genuinely don't know. I kept seeing that article and the one quote that I was like, I don't want to know more information.
Yeah, but I also feel like once you've opened that door, you might as well walk through it.
I don't know. Sometimes you can look at a door and go, that did me enough trauma.
Already traumatized. Let's go. All right, so do we want to give ratings for this one? I feel like it's a tough one to rate, but let's make it clear. We're rating the documentary, not Gwen Shamblin, not the Way Down programs. We are just rating the documentary, which I feel is very important given my rating.
Michael does not speak for me. I'm going to give this one...
No, I'm speaking for the cast.
No, Michael does not speak for me. So... my rating is 1 Jim Baker bucket, just filled with slop.
I'm giving this the second Station of the Cross. Jesus carries this cross because it did just feel like a weight was dragging behind me the whole time that I was watching this documentary.
I'm giving this documentary 5 out of 5 cans of hairspray because that's what it took to get Gwen's hair that big. And you know what? The ozone is a lot better for that plane crash. I'm standing by that one.
Very good.
I like it.
No, it's good. It's good.
Oh, it's fucked up, but...
Well, when we're not making jokes about the environment being better off because of somebody's death in a plane crash, where can people find us on the internet?
I'm at Green History on Twitter.
I'm at Michael's Diamonds on Twitter, but I'm outsourcing a new handle. Help me. I want something more interesting.
I'm at AaronSXL on Twitter, where I talk about health policy and tabletop RPGs. You can listen to the other podcast I do at Mortified Pod. We just released an episode about Star Kids Aladdin parody Twisted, which was fun. I also just released an essay about the Taz Imbalance miniseries and nostalgia and the ways in which it can trap us. So check that out if that sounds interesting to you.
It's a good read and also lots of Stardew Valley.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's a good read.
I got some mods if anybody's interested.
Sounds like an illegal deal. You guys interested in some mods?
Yeah. Next week we're gonna talk a little bit about what our Christmas episodes are gonna be like, but I think we're gonna be doing like Christian urban legends sort of. So I think that'll be a good one. And we will see you all next week. But until then, if this horrible, depressing documentary makes you want to cry, just remember that it is okay to cry because even Jesus wept. We'll see you all next time.